My Govan and Melanin, and welcome back to Medieval Art. I'm Dr. Brian Keane, and I'm joined again with an epic fellowship of curators and art historians to discuss the Rings of Power. This week, we're going to be considering how the world looks, the making of Middle-earth. Again, I'm here with Drs. Diva Zumaya, Larisa Grollemond, C Schaefer, John McQuillen, and Sophia McCabe. Larisa, how does the world of Middle-earth in the Rings of Power look to you?
I've been really fascinated to see what costume design looks like. So we have so much of the influence of the Peter Jackson films also combined with some new details and a lot of what we maybe expect from medieval fantasy. So we've still got our swooping sleeves, our flowing gowns, and then each of the peoples of Middle-earth has their own style. So you get a particular Númenórean style that is quite different from the Middle-earth styles of the dwarves or the elves, say. And I've been really interested to see the role that clothing is playing in the making of this world.
I think you're right. For me as well, it is that sense that we know immediately where we are based on those touches of costuming detail. Diva, what's standing out to you in the making of Middle-earth?
For me, it feels like the kind of expansive world making of Jackson's films has been expanded literally. And with Númenor, I was so excited to see like how Mediterranean it looked and how kind of I could pick out 4 or 5 different, reference points for one costume, for example. So I think there's like a really rich tapestries of things laying on to worlds we already know. And of course, some we don't. But yeah, like Larisa said, there's also this easy recognizability of like, oh, elf world.
Well, I wonder, Sarah, then what are some of those elements that you've noticed that what constitutes the elf world versus the dwarf realm or Númenor specifically? Has anything stood out to you so far?
Well, I like Diva and Larisa have been fascinated by Númenor since that's what kind of the focus of the previous episode that was released last week. And we were kind of talking before, and I agree with another comment about the kind of clear references to things like ancient Babylonia, which seems like a kind of perfect historical touchstone to a place like Númenor. So I like to see elements of that visual culture coming in. And it's also kind of distinct, I think, from the very recognizable elements of a lot of Elvish culture and a lot of Dwarvish culture that, again, is established in the Peter Jackson films and that we see continued through in some ways the kind of more flowing Art Nouveau kind of style of the elves versus the more geometric style of the dwarves. I think those are also very fitting, and seeing them continued beyond the Jackson films into this enterprise is really great. But I'm also really enjoying seeing the new things emerge in the show.
There's a lot to work with, but also a lot of new material to give us. I wonder, John, since you have that great map of Middle-earth behind you, what has stood out to you in the making of Middle-earth?
I think one of the things that I'm sort of most aware of, particularly as we've just brought up with the release last week, our kind of first big vision of Númenor, is seeing that architecture, but then seeing what sort of the grandiose nature of Númenorian architecture, but then how it was sort of distilled down previously in the Peter Jackson films for Gondor. So it's like they've taken that idea of the Númenorian architecture of Gondor and what Arnor would have looked like, and just kind of exploded it into an entire civilization 1,000 years prior. And so you see how, the grandiose nature of the Númenorians, comes down to what ends up being the realms of men and Middle-earth.
It is fascinating that they've given super fans these either both subtle and really overt nods to the broader legendarium of Tolkien, that we're able to see the link between Númenor and Gondor, as you mentioned, which I think for me was a real treat, that there is true love and passion behind the making of this series. And Sophia, for you, you have that great view of Lindon behind you, but what has stood out for you in the making of Middle-earth so far?
I agree with what was already said here about Númenor's architecture and kind of like the world building there. Certainly touchstones to medieval cities that we know and like ancient cities like Babylon that we are aware of for sure. But also what I loved seeing were these collections, for example, in Lindon with Kellenborg's cabinet collection of materials and items. But also when we were at Númenor, the Hall of Laws and the scrolls with the finials at the end. So this is, again, touch points to what we know from medieval materiality.
I think that's what's been so wonderful, is to see those various reference points. So in addition to Babylonia, I'm seeing lots of references to Venice, as a sort of waterway city, but also to Byzantium in general. I remember that view sailing along the Bosphorus and looking at the Golden Horn and seeing the Hagia Sophia and the Blue Mosque on the horizon. It reminded me so much of Numenor, the capital of Armenelos. In touching on the various art historical and global traditions, I mean, Larisa, you have a wonderful backdrop, and I wonder if you and Sarah could maybe lead us in a conversation about why it is that those images stood out to you in relation to our episode so far.
Sure. My background is inspired by Sarah, who posted The Consummation of Empire by Thomas Cole as a good comparison, visual comparison, also ideological comparison for Numenor. So I have the next phase of his series, which is The Destruction of Empire, which felt fitting for where we're going. But I also wanted to touch a little bit on the kind of overall aesthetic of the world being also quite related to illustration and the kind of smoothness of the CGI of this world, not just being indebted to Peter Jackson, but being indebted to the kind of idea of illustration that has been such a part of the making of Middle-earth in previous iterations of the stories. And to have that kind of come together has been really interesting. I think there's been a lot of criticism of the CGI, but I think it has a lot to do with artistic illustration too. And I just wanted to bring that out as well.
Thank you. I love that. And Sarah, did you have other thoughts about the series?
I really like that point that Larisa just made about illustration. And I was actually just talking about it today in a class I'm teaching this semester on kind of the emergence of fantasy imagery and fantasy illustration. And a phrase that's been kind of bubbling around in my head is epic realism. And I think that kind of very precise, kind of finished, very clear detail that you see in a lot of the CGI that, like Larisa brought up, I think that phrase for me kind of evokes that that aesthetic. So with the consummation of Empire by Thomas Cole, the predecessor to the painting that is Larisa's background, it's kind of this gleaming amalgamation of different styles of architecture and this imagined empire at the height of its power, kind of like Numenor is. And if we're familiar with the broader legendarium, we know what happens to Numenor, so it's totally appropriate that Larisa has that as her background. I also would just draw attention to Art Deco as a point of influence for the dwarves. But what comes to my mind when I think about scenes like Dwaro Dwelf in the Peter Jackson films is actually a series of images, and particularly I think of Belshazzar's feast, but Babylonian imagery by John Martin in the 19th century, and again that kind of epic panoramic landscape. So I'll be interested to see if John Martin seems like a point of departure for some of the set designers and production designers moving forward.
These are really wonderful touch points because, again, the creative teams have been pulling from so many places. And I love that we as art historians are also being drawn in so many directions and noticing so many influences. I mean, Diva, is there more that you'd like to share with us about this world building and illustration traditions, or just the general look of our world?
Yeah, just building off of Larisa and Sarah's points, I think with Numenor, what struck me was also how, like, the Amalfi Coast, it felt like the Mediterranean Italian view. And I think Cole's a great example or touch point because it reminded me of like the kind of glowing, warm golden landscapes of the 19th century, like Turner, and you have this sort of fantastical, almost exaggerated glowiness about the whole place. I got really obsessed as well with Queen Muriel. As a Klimt, I found this Klimt painting. I think with Numenor in general, you have this overlay of almost like Art Nouveau itself, this really nautical feeling and this Italian feeling. The way the city is built into the hill behind me as well, really felt like a Mediterranean city.
We have a lot to continue discussing, and in our final moments, I wonder, John and Sophia, one last touch point for you. Where are we going in the next episode that you're looking forward to?
So many things. One very quick point. So thrilled the Hall of Records was mainly scrolls on Numenor and not codices, even though you see those in other places, but it really kind of hammers home like the historical nature of those documents. I mean, I'm ready to go back to Linden. It was great to see Numenor, but like I'm ready to go back to Middle Earth now.
And Sophia.
Linden, it is my background here. So yeah, I would love to explore that a little bit more. Again, back to the collections there, the kind of intricacies around the kind of objects that were there, the statuaries and such. So, for me, it's going back to how designs happen. And so this idea of, the production design team looking at works of art to bring it into a kind of reality.
Thank you all, and namarie until our next recording.